Hi, and welcome to tonight's live webinar. So tonight we're continuing our basics series, and we're really focusing in on the sonic qualities. If you haven't seen it already, go and check out the last week's sonic qualities webinar. But tonight we're looking at dynamic processing. Dynamic processing is one of four. So you've got dynamic processing, frequency range, you have stereo field, and finally depth of field. Those are the main areas in which we control and manipulate sound within our recordings and within our mixes. So we're just going to focus in on dynamic processing tonight. So the content, we're going to look at all of the processing. So from the recording to the input, the mixing, and then the mastering, how controlling the volume of a mix changes depending on the process you're working on, or depending on what part of the workflow you're working on. We're going to look more briefly at the dynamic range, how it's controlled. Then we're going to look at some of the tools. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to cover all the tools, so I've just focused in on two. That's compression and limiting. And we're going to have a kind of in-depth discussion in what it means to use compression effectively and what it means to use limiting effectively. And once again, if any of you guys are around at the end, we'll do a question and answer, and we'll try and get some of the questions answered from this week and some of the people that have emailed in. Recording, mixing, and mastering. So, as you may have gathered, it starts with recording the input, whether that be a microphone or whether that be a jack input, or whether it be some kind of DI. It all starts with the input going into your console or into your desk. Now, this first part of recording is called the gain. So we're looking at gain, we're looking at controlling that gain. The main mission within the digital arena is that we don't get any digital clipping. Once you get digital clipping, there's no way of, well, there is, but it's not the easiest thing to get rid of. It's unlike the old days of analog, where the kind of the warmth of the fuzz that you would get from it clipping and going into the red, that no longer exists. If it goes into the red and digital, it's just not nice. It's just a complete crackle and hiss, and it doesn't work. So let's just look at the recording section. You're going to see where my dial is, and let me point my mouse over it so you can see this. Where my dial is, it says it's 0 dB. And for every other part of the mix, this is the top level. You can see this is 0 dB here, 0 dB here. But when you're recording, you're looking at this +6. It's because it's okay when you're recording to take it into the plus numbers. And what the +6 is telling you is if you go any higher than that, you're going to get digital clipping. You do want to get the most amount of gain out of your recording, and you're looking at this idea of noise to ratio, signal to noise ratio, which basically says if you haven't got enough signal, you're going to get more noise than anything else. And obviously it goes the other way if you get complete noise, but you have to monitor at a certain level. And I tend to think that -6 dB is a good area to start from, your lowest frequency, especially in a pop mix. And that'll obviously change if you're mixing for a classical album, or if you're mixing for some other genre. But for pop music, the -6 dB is the kind of the lowest volume you want to take that to. The 0 dB is the range you're really aiming for, and the consistency of 0 dB is what you really want. And then obviously you can take it all the way up to +4. I wouldn't recommend taking it into +6. You've got some dangerous areas there if you do go, unless you're specifically looking for that quality. It's not somewhere you want to go. So then we're going to move into the mixing stage. So once all of our tracks are recorded and we've got that recording done properly, and remember, if your recording hasn't been done properly and you do have this digital distortion, go back and record it properly. There's no substitute. A lot of people say, oh, we'll fix it in the mix, oh, we'll fix it in the master. No, there's no substitute for getting it right in the recording, in the recording phase, okay? Bad recordings make for bad mixes, and so on, and that's a real good point to work from. Don't work from the rule of, oh, I'll fix it in post. It's not, it's doable, but it's not right. So we'll look at the mixing. So once again, we're looking at this 0 dB. At the mixing stage, we're not going to use compression. Sorry, we're not going to use limiting. We're going to focus in on volumes, so levels, and compression and gating, maximizing, things like that, okay? To really control those volumes without putting too much digital artifacts into the actual recording itself. So we're going to control those volumes, bring them down so that they create this broad mix of volumes, okay? So as you can see from what I've got here, I tend to pull my mix down. In the early stages of mixing, when you're brand new to this stuff, you think, oh, more volume, more volume. You end up pushing this all up, and what you end up doing is losing all the headroom. And once you've lost all the headroom, there's no way to go. So the best port of call whilst you're mixing is to pull things down. If you start hearing that something's too quiet, it's probably because it's been overshadowed by something else. So pulling the thing that's overshadowing it down to give more space to the thing that's quiet is sometimes a good thing. And compression can be really good at this, especially with vocals and other kind of parts that vary in dynamic range. It's good to add some compression to this. And what this does is it flattens out the dynamic range. It reduces the dynamic range so that it's easier to control. So you're not losing it, so you're not losing it in parts of the mix. It's always kind of remaining constant at the point of the mix where you want it. And if you do want to lose it in the mix, then you control it via volumes to get rid of it. And it gives you complete control over it. So those are the tools we want to work with during the mix stage. And we're going to go into compression. I'm going to kind of give you some tips on how to use it and how it should work, and we'll give you some experiments to kind of go away and play with. Then finally, the mastering section. Now, you want to leave yourself headroom for the mastering, so we are pushing it to the 0 dB. Whilst you're mixing, always look at these output meters and try and get this kind of -6 to -3, kind of everything below that. The reason for this is because we want to create headroom. Headroom is so important. If you don't create headroom, you're going to get what's called ducking, okay? Where if you have an instrument which is too loud and it's going into the plus numbers in your mix, when you put a limiter on, a limiter is a hard compressor, so basically anything that goes past 0 dB will just be cut out completely. So if you haven't left headroom, you're going to get this ducking effect where it quickly and very suddenly goes quiet, and it's very obvious, and it's very it's just not, it doesn't sound very nice, unless you're doing radio presenting. It's not the effect do you really want to go for. Once again, I don't know, depending on your mix, but generally ducking is not something you want in a pop mix. So we are looking at headroom. We're looking that everything, when it finishes, will finish at 0 dB or just slightly below. If you put a commercial recording from iTunes into your DAW, say Logic or Cubase, and you look at the metering, even in the mixing, if you look at the metering, you'll see that it rarely goes below -3 dB, and it's pretty much always on 0 dB, and that's really good mastering, making sure they maximize the volumes. And the reason we need this is to make it more consistent across lots of different kinds of speakers. It's not good enough to make our mix good for our speakers, because there's lots of different kinds of speakers: small, big, medium, headphones, small headphones, you name it, different configurations. And what we've realized over these many years is that 0 dB range, the closer we can get to that, the more consistent we can make our mixes across all fields. It's not the only parameter that we look at, but it's certainly one of them, okay? And then finally our output. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the process that we look at and how it changes from raw recording, mixing and mastering. And just in case you were unsure, I've kind of broken it down into 3 different job roles. And if you were in a professional studio, it would generally be 3 different people. So look at this top one. You've got our mission as a recording engineer: push the gain as high as possible without distorting. That is your mission. That is the sole job that you've been employed for. You're the person to push it. Generally, that's without using compression, okay? Generally, you don't want to be applying compression or any of those sort of effects during the recording phase. Those can be added later. So your job is very much to monitor those gains and get the best possible outcome. The next part is the mission of the mixing engineer stroke producer, and their job is to find the space for the individual instruments, tracks and vocals within the mix. Getting space using the sonic qualities, that's their job, okay? making sure you're giving yourself enough headroom for when it goes to the next stage, but making sure everything can be heard perfectly and it's sitting well in the mix. And then finally, our mastering engineer, which is a very specialized area. You'll quite often hear people say, actually, I'm not a very good master. And that's true of most mixing engineers and recording engineers. It takes a very special kind of ear to do mastering well. Okay, and I must confess to not being amazing at it myself, but you know, I can get general good masters, but it is a very specialist area. There are good tools out there that can do this job, but generally it's few and far between. And their job, the mastering engineer's job, is to get the mix as close to the 0 dB mark as possible. Okay. Compression. So let's have a little look at this wonderful tool. If you're going to take music production seriously, you're going to need to get your head around compression. Now, a lot of people, if you say, oh, what does a compressor do? A lot of people would always respond, oh, the way I got used to it is just by twiddling dials. And that's certainly the way that I learned. And it wasn't until I started teaching the subject that I went into more depth about what each of the parameters do and how to control it more. And a lot of what we do as music engineers and music tech people is we play. That's the best way of learning this stuff. And the more you play with this stuff, the better you get at it. Eventually, you should have some background knowledge, but here's my little kind of brief overview of what all these parameters do and how they control the mix. So you can see, go down one, you can see we have a few common parameters, and depending on which compressor you use, these will change slightly, but pretty much all compressors have the following parameters: ratio, threshold, attack, release, knee, gain reduction, and then gain. Okay, those are the general things. So we'll whiz through these and tell you what each of them does. So our compressor, as you can see from this diagram, we have an uncompressed signal and we have a compressed signal. It's quite a heavily compressed signal. It's almost limited, but it's not quite. If it was limited, both the top region, this area here, and this bottom region would be almost flat. Okay, that's what limiting would do. The compressor gives us a little bit of variance. As you can see, this is the same piece of audio, so as you can see this bit here to this bit here, how much flatter it looks. The peaks aren't kind of as clean as they are here. They're more flattened out, and that goes across the whole thing. Okay, so the first tool, or the first parameter that we're going to look at, is the threshold. This sets the compression level. The compressor will only react once the signal level has passed this point. Okay, and the point that we're talking about is this one here. Okay, currently set to -24 dB. On this diagram here, this is the threshold point here. It's basically, it doesn't do anything. It just sets a threshold. It says, okay, once it's got to this point, we're going to start reacting. The compressor is going to start working. Okay, so this line here is saying anything that goes above this line is going to be compressed. Anything that goes above this line is going to be compressed. But the next job is how much to compress it by. Our main mission, especially if it's vocal, is to flatten out these peaks as much as possible without putting any kind of digital artifacts into them. So it's not good practice to flatten them out completely, because you will get ducking sounds, but you do want to kind of ease these out so you're not getting such drastic comparisons between the two. Okay, so there's our first parameter, -24 dB, and it sets the point at which the compressor starts to work. Then comes the ratio. Now, the ratio sets how hard the compressor works. And up here we've got a little kind of thing that I like to do. So the amount of compression applied to the signal. A 5:1 ratio means that if the signal rises 5 decibels above the threshold, so here's our threshold level here. If it rises 5 decibels above the threshold, the output signal will only be 1 decibel. So it will reduce it from 5 decibels to 1 decibel, giving us some gain reduction. Oh, excuse me. Giving us gain reduction of 4 decibels. And we'll talk about gain reduction in a minute, but it's important to know that the more ratio you add, the harder the compression. So if I was to do a 1:1, let me show you on the line here, this line here is nothing. But once it gets here is where the ratio starts to apply. Now the 1:1 line is this one here. Now this 1:1 line does nothing. It lets the signal through. No matter where this threshold is, 1:1 lets the signal through. Basically 1 decibel is 1 decibel, and that's it, okay? And then 2 to 1 decibel, it's reducing it very softly. 4 to 1 decibel, a bit more hard, and then we start getting into the limiting range, which is 10 to 1, okay, when you really want a hard compressor. Okay, so that's the ratio. So we looked at threshold, which tells us the point at which we want the signal to start getting reduced, in this case -24, and then the ratio, which sets how hard we want the compressor to work once the signal goes above -24 decibels. Okay, so here we go. Once we've set that, you're going to see that you've got this gain reduction. Okay, once you've got gain reduction, you're basically going to make your audio track, or your track in general, quieter. You've made it quieter by 5 decibels. Okay, it tells you that here. So what do you think you've got to do next? It's fairly simple. You've got to put that 5 decibels back. This will effectively give the appearance of the track being louder. Okay, so we've taken it out using ratio, and I've got a 2 to 1 ratio here. Using ratio and using threshold, which is here, -27.5, they have set up how much compression we're going to get. Basically, those two dials do everything, okay? That sets up all your compressor. The other dials kind of make it a little more easier to cope with, but we'll get onto that in a second. So these two dials set up everything. Then we've lost 5 decibels. Because we've reduced all the volumes to flatten out that dynamic range, we've lost 5 decibels. So in comes the gain dial. We're going to put it back. And I've pushed this one to +7 dB. So I've taken 5 decibels out, but I've put 7 back in. So effectively it's made it a lot louder, okay? And it's flattened that out completely. The next one we're going to look at is attack and release. Now, attack and release, if you think of attack first, once your signal gets to the threshold point, the attack determines how quickly the threshold is going to react, or how quickly the compression is going to react. The faster your compressor, so if this was 0 milliseconds, that would be instant. It would just happen straight away, and you might get ducking. If it was really sudden, you might get ducking. Whereas if you set the attack a little bit higher, it's going to ease itself in. Okay, so it looks at when the compression starts to happen, and then it eases itself in. And it's the same with the release. The release, once the signal goes below the threshold of -27.5, it then reacts how fast it wants to stop compressing the signal. So if you set it at 0, it'd be instant, and this is 38 milliseconds, so it's going to just a nice quick gradual, and once again it's going to stop any kind of artificialness, it's going to stop any kind of sudden behavior that you don't want. It's going to ease itself in. The knee reacts with that. You've got a hard knee and a soft knee. Where it's currently at is this kind of almost hard knee area, okay? And the hard knee determines how the attack and release work. And you've got to think about this as a straight line. If it's a hard knee, it's a straight line, and it gradually goes in. If it's a soft knee, it's more of a curved line, and it's more gentle, okay? And that works with the attack and release. The best way of working these things out is just to have a little play with them. But in a nutshell, that is compression. Now below, I've given you a little link here to a presentation. Some of the slides from what I've just shown you are part of that presentation, but there are a few more, and there's a few more examples. So if you want to have a look at that presentation and kind of get some more information, there's also on Music Tech Student, there's also a couple of other posts on compression, some more video based posts that can identify these things a little bit further, okay? So if you're still unsure about what compression does, firstly go and have a play, apply it to one of your tracks and see what it does, because there is no better way of using compression than actually using it. And then secondly, go and get a bit more information to how to use it more thoroughly, okay? When you start out, it is a bit of trial and error, but you'll soon become aware that this is probably one of the most important tools in our arsenal. Okay, so using it well is really important. So limiting, and we've talked about limiting, and it's a fairly straightforward one for me to explain. If you've understood everything I've talked about in compression, this should be really easy. There's only a couple of parameters, and the way I think about this is it's hard. It's like hitting a shelf, and I've put these two lines in because this is telling us that this is our 0 dB, and once the signal hits this shelf, it will be reduced. 100% to that line. Now, if you look at our signal here, if we reduce that now, we are going to get massive amount of ducking. This obviously isn't the 0 dB line. 0 dB line would normally be up here somewhere. But if this was the 0 dB line, and we would get massive amount of ducking, because these would just be, these peaks here would be put down to here, and it would just affect the whole thing. It would just get this massive ducking, a drop in signal, okay? There's a couple of things that you will want to look at. So the output gain is always set to 0. Don't set it higher than that, because it will push it higher. The output, the maximum output of your signal will go higher. We put it as 0 dB so that we know that everything that goes into that will hit that 0 dB, and it won't go any higher than that, and we're going to get a commercial, or semi-commercial mix where nothing goes past that. It's important to say that in your mixing chain, the limiter is generally the last thing on the chain, okay? It's the last thing that happens. Now, the gain, this is input signal, okay? So your input gain, if you are monitoring too low, it's going to be very difficult to push up to the limiter, and the limiter will never work, okay? Which effectively makes it useless. It makes it worse than useless. So for instance, if your highest signal was minus 3 decibels, you're going to have to bring up this input gain to plus 3 decibels in order to get this output to work properly, okay? So you're going to have to take that, done it again, what am I doing? What am I doing? There I am. Okay, so in order to get the gain in order to get the compression working properly, you will have to play with that input gain and just monitor how much you have to push it up, because you do want some reduction. That's absolutely okay. Once again, you're going to set the release for how fast it stops limiting the signal, and the look ahead is quite a nice function. If it sees, the look ahead is kind of this mechanical process where if it sees that things are going to be too harsh, it will kind of add some kind of special algorithm to kind of make it less harsh. And it's quite a nice mechanism. Not all limiters will have that, but this particular one, which is the Logic one, does have that, which is quite nice. But there are literally just two parameters in a limiter, and that is input gain and at the output level, okay? And I think that's pretty much all I have to say about limiting. So it brings us onto the Q&A. Now, if you guys have any Q&As, come in now, and I'll flip over in a second and just see if there's anyone asking questions over there. I did have this question this week about monitoring levels. In order to be a good mixing engineer, recording engineer, mastering engineer, monitoring and understanding what you're getting is probably the most important thing you're gonna have to do. And there's lots of analyzing tools built into all of the Dawns now, actually. Logic, Cubase, Pro Tools, they've all got really good tools for analyzing signal, analyzing pretty much any aspect of your mix. Learn how to use those tools. Learn what all the different parameters mean, so that you can analyze your mixes more thoroughly. Okay, let's have a look over the Q&A, see what we got. I really like this Q&A tool. Do we have any questions? Not currently. Okay, so let's go to the discussion tool. Make sure I don't miss any. I missed someone last week. Got told off. No, nothing there. Okay, well, once again, thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure to deliver these webinars, and please feel free to get in touch if you want me to kind of answer a question. Next week we're going to look at the frequency range, so we'll get an in-depth look at how EQs work, how the bandpass filters work, how low-pass filters work, how high-pass filters work, and so on. So please join us in the next lesson or next week's webinar to kind of have a look at those. And in the meantime, if you've got any questions you want to ask, please do. And I'll see you next time.